All right, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to explore how conservation and environmental justice interact. Conservation has a clear goal, right? To protect biodiversity and ecosystems. And environmental justice has its own goal, right? To ensure fairness, equity, and voice in environmental decision making, as we talked about. Sometimes these goals align. They create opportunities where protecting nature also supports human well being, but often they collide. Conservation successes may come at human costs, and justice concerns may complicate conservation objectives. So, in this session, we're going to briefly look at examples of where conservation and justice clash and where they reinforce each other. Then, we're going to take a step back and we're going to think about how do we study these complex interactions. I'm going to introduce you to some of the intro topics on the tools in social science, both qualitative and quantitative, and show you how reflexivity and ethics are essential in environmental justice research. So let's dive in. So first, we're going to talk about protected areas and displacement. One of the clearest examples of tensions between conservation and justice comes from protected areas. The very first U.S. national park, Yellowstone, was established in 1872. And this iconic story celebrates a huge victory in wilderness preservation. But what is less often remembered is that indigenous peoples, Native Americans, including the Shoshone, Bannock, and Crow, were displaced, evicted, to make way for the park. This model of fortress conservation spread worldwide. In East Africa, Maasai pastoralists were evicted and are still being evicted today from lands that have become Serengeti and Amboseli national parks. And the global conservation community celebrates these parks as victories. Wildlife thrive, ecosystems are protected, but for Native Americans, indigenous communities, the Maasai, this story is one of loss, genocide, violence, devastation. Land, livelihoods, and cultural ties have been erased. Environmental justice asks us to see both of these sides. That's why it's such a powerful tool. Conservation gains, but at a human cost. And it asks us to question whether conservation can ever be just if it depends on dispossession. Carbon markets and land rights is another major site of friction in climate conservation, especially carbon markets. Take the REDD+ program, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation. The idea is to protect forests so they can store carbon and then sell the carbon credits to offset emissions elsewhere, right? On paper, this sounds like a win-win, right? Forests are preserved, climate change is slowed, and money flows into developing countries, right? But on the ground, forests are more than carbon. They are sources of food, medicine, firewood, and spiritual identity. People are living in these environments, right? When REDD+ projects are implemented, local communities, often the most marginalized and many times indigenous communities, they lose access to these forests. They're not consulted. There's no recognitional or procedural justice. Questions emerge, right? Who owns the carbon? Who profits from the carbon credits? Who loses access to the resources that sustain daily life? Without careful planning and justice safeguards, this climate conservation risks repeating the old mistakes of fortress conservation, creating problems with global benefits and local costs. Species conservation versus livelihoods, this is what I study in terms of human-wildlife conflicts. This is a really strong third friction that arises. This is where conservationists, celebrate, specifically, let's say when lions rebound in Africa or when wolves are reintroduced in North America. But for livestock owners, ranchers, pastoralists, these successes often come with losses and increased risk to their livelihoods. Lions take down cows and cattle. Wolves will also take down livestock, and this can wipe out an entire livelihood system, an entire wealth of an entire household, right, in one night. Farmers who already live at the margins have to bear these costs, right? They're not getting the benefits from these species increases, right? Ecotourism is sometimes touted as a solution, but in reality, a lot of this wealth is captured and the livestock owners are not seeing benefits. So species population recovery, lion and wolf rebounds can be seen as conservation victories, but for some people most directly affected, they feel like injustices. It feels like an imposed coexistence. The global community values these species' survival, but the local community has to shoulder the burden, and their voices are much smaller in the overall dialogue. Environmental justice seeks to reframe this, right? We want to ask, is it fair to ask rural farmers to carry the costs of what the global community defines as a success or as a goal? And there's a lot of opportunities to find synergies here, right? I don't want to position it as like it's a total dichotomy and these sides are constantly in conflict, right? It's important to remember that conservation and justice, they don't always collide, right? There are also cases of synergies where conservation outcomes and justice outcomes reinforce each other. Namibia is a great example of that. Since the 1990s, the government has supported community conservancies, right? These are legally recognized groups that give local communities ownership and revenue from wildlife management. This model aligns conservation with livelihoods quite closely. Communities benefit from tourism and hunting revenue while wildlife populations recover. And this was done through a really diligent effort. Is it perfect? No, but it's a great case study. Maybe consider payments for ecosystem services, right? Or PES. In Costa Rica is a great example. Farmers are compensated for protecting forests. Instead of clearing land for cattle, they're paid to keep forests standing, which benefits both biodiversity and carbon capture. And in many countries, co-management approaches, bringing governments and communities together to share decision-making power, is a great model of recognitional and procedural justice in action, mitigating perhaps structural justice concerns. These models recognize that justice isn't a barrier to conservation, right? It can be the actual leverage, the tool or the foundation for lasting success. And so those are just some high-level examples. We're going to dive a lot deeper and actually go into some specific case studies, but I just want to sort of paint the picture, and the reason that I use conservation so closely, and I'll refer back to it, I just feel like it's such a clear application, right, of these issues. Policy and climate justice and some of these things can get a little bit wonky, right? But I feel like in conservation we can really kind of see these issues clearly, and we can see these synergies and feedback. But give me some feedback as well. Send me an email and let me know if you would like some additional examples, or if maybe conservation is becoming too specific for you, okay? But I'm gonna run with that for the most part of the lectures in the course. So social science, is my background. I'm a conservation social scientist, and I believe that it has a really strong power to shed light on these issues. Conservation and justice are so deeply entwined. We have to figure out how to study these relationships, and this is where social science is so important, right? Social science is the study of human society, culture, institutions, and behavior. In conservation, it focuses on human-nature interactions, how communities experience conservation, such as programs or environmental protection initiatives, and how they respond to policies and how justice is or isn't addressed, right? Social science uses two broad toolkits, which is, pretty common across many different disciplines, right? Qualitative methods are about depth. They capture meaning and lived experience. This might include semi-structured interviews with farmers about elephant crop raids, focus groups who are going to bring folks together to discuss conservation trade-offs or go over like a theory of change about their ideas for a new conservation program, or ethnography, where a researcher lives in a community to understand daily realities. I conducted an ethnography for my dissertation. I lived in a community in Thailand and studied human-elephant conflict for about 2.5 years. It's a really, really important and critical way to get this really deep data that just dropping in for a week or a month, that you're never going to see these things and you're never going to understand them, right? These methods are invaluable for really capturing those deep stories and finding the voices of some of the most marginalized, right? Quantitative methods are about breadth and comparability, right? They are going to let us measure patterns across households or communities. They're going to look for generalizable data that we can apply to other situations. They might look for causality. Does X, reduce, this in Y, or does X produce this influence on Y, right? They are going to include things like quantitative surveys where we have like Likert scale, multiple choice questions, statistical models. They're going to maybe link ecological data to social outcomes, or conservation policies to like measurable social outcomes, or economic valuation. This is one of the most common. It's going to put a price tag on a conservation intervention or an environmental injustice or a program, right, to see how this changes the socio-demographics of our target population. Both approaches are important, right? Together, they're going to ensure that conservation and environmental justice research doesn't just measure trees and species, but also looks at these from a numerical, but also a sort of descriptive and deep way, right? Putting them together in a mixed method study can be quite powerful in this space. And it's important to understand some concepts that we're going to talk about, especially, when we're talking about methods, we need to think about how we see the world and how we practice science and research responsibly. Applied practice as well. But first, ethics, right? Research must always avoid harm. Do no harm. It must ensure informed consent, getting, understanding that the people you're working with, the community, understand what you're doing. They're signing a form that's clearly stating the goals of the survey before they take on any sort of research or any sort of work, right? They understand what they're getting themselves into, and they understand what your goals and purposes are, right? You must always seek to protect confidentiality and protect the identities of the people that you're working with, right? They might expose sensitive data that you don't want to get them in trouble with, right? And share benefits fairly, right? Make sure that whatever we're trying to create an improvement or introduce something new, that these benefits can be shared fairly and that we're considering equity, right? Formal review boards like the IRB, so universities have institutional review boards which are going to review your research methods and give you clearance. You have to take trainings to really understand how to engage ethically with research. They're going to enforce this to ensure this is being standardized and practiced. But ethics in EJ research really goes further, right? This is practicing reciprocity, ensuring that communities are not just studied, but also benefit, right? We're going to talk a bit more about this as we go, but this idea of reciprocity is really important. We don't want to be extracting, knowledge or data from communities and that they're not getting anything in return, right? That's not equitable, that's not just. Second, and super crucial, is reflexivity, right? Reflexivity means turning that lens back on ourselves. We have to ask ourselves as researchers, what biases do I carry into this project, right? How does my background, my training, my identity shape what I see as important? For example, myself, a Western educated scientist studying in Thailand, I might reflect on power dynamics, right? Am I, successfully amplifying local voices, or am I imposing my own agenda? This is not a single exercise. It's an ongoing commitment that you should be engaging with throughout the research process, okay? The next slide is going to talk about steps to take that on. Your epistemology is also very important, right? How we know what we know. There's 3 broad approaches in EJ research. Are these the only epistemological approaches? No, not at all. Positivist is going to assume objective truths exist and can be measured, right? This is your quantitative causal style research. Interpretive is going to emphasize meaning, context, and lived experience. This is qualitative. This is crucial for interviews, ethnography. Critical is going to focus on power and inequality. It's going to ask who's benefiting, who loses, how can these systems change, right? We may be employing all of these different epistemologies in our study. We might also be introducing local epistemologies, local ecological knowledge, feminist thinking, a whole host of different epistemologies to better understand this complex web of this environmental injustice we're studying, right? But these are sort of the classical framings you can think about. Each epistemology is going to shape the questions we ask and the answers that we are going to categorize as supported within our research, right? In EJ research, being explicit as explicit as possible at every step about our epistemological stances will help us avoid reproducing hidden biases, okay? We're going to talk about this as you talk about designing research projects and proposals. But the reflexivity is really important that keeps us in check with this, right? So with the reflexivity, we're going to be constantly turning the lens inward, which can be done by keeping journals. It can be done by keeping notes as you're doing data analysis. It can be taking down memos, right? We're not neutral observers as much as we want to be. We're not in a lab, right? It's impossible, right? And so we have to keep turning that lens to ourselves. We bring our own assumptions and we have to evaluate those, okay? And as we're unpacking those biases and positionalities, we're recognizing power dynamics, not only that we're bringing to the table, but we're seeing within the study that we're conducting, right? And we're documenting what we're seeing within the system. We are making reciprocal obligations. We are making sure that we're not just taking, we're also providing benefits, we're consulting, we're trying to address needs, we're holding ourselves accountable and those around us accountable, we're being very transparent in our processes, and it's ongoing, right? And this should help inform how we're going to make our research question, right? Our research question is one of the most powerful ways to align this thinking, right? And traditional, maybe like environmental research is often going to ask, like how many wolves took down cattle in the last year, right? I don't know, that was a bad one, but, or like what is the economic loss from livestock predation, okay? These are valuable questions, right? But they are only focusing narrowly on quantifiable outcomes, distributive justice. You could think about it like that, right? They risk missing the lived experiences of communities and the fairness of potential solutions, right? So our results might show a lot of cattle are being taken down, we should cull the wolves, right? But what if the indigenous community has a different relationship with the wolves, right? Or what if we're missing some of the key social cultural context within the system, right? A justice-centered research question is going to flip the script, flip the perspective, right? It's going to instead ask, how do farmers experience an elephant crop raid, and what strategies do they see as fair and effective in solutions, right? See how this shifts. We're going from counting events to understanding meaning. We're going from external measurement to communal perspectives, right? So they should do three things. They should always seek to center community voices, right? They start from what matters to the people most effective, right? They should address equity and fairness. They look not only at outcomes, but also at processes and recognition, okay? And we want to try to have an interdisciplinary focus, right? We want to try to link ecology with society and consider environmental outcomes with human well-being, right? We're not trying to seek to separate humans and nature, okay? And again, for this activity and for your proposals and for the assignments you're going to do, you don't need to be perfect, right? These don't need to be field-ready projects, but you can start practicing by taking any conservation issue or environmental issue and rephrasing it in a justice-centered way. It's kind of a fun activity to think about, especially when you're reading manuscripts and things like that aren't focusing on environmental justice, right? You can really force yourself to consider whose perspectives are being prioritized, what kinds of knowledge are considered as counting here, and whether the question itself is promoting justice or maybe undermining it, right? So remember, the questions that you ask shape the answers you find. If you want to study things fairly in a justice-based perspective, you must critically consider how you're asking questions and putting justice and community's perspectives at the center, okay? Again, start small. Research questions should always be clear, feasible, and relevant, okay? So again, just in a short recap, conservation and environmental justice are deeply connected, right? Sometimes they collide, sometimes they align. Understanding these dynamics is really crucial and possible through social science study. Qualitative and quantitative methods give us these tools to analyze things from many different dimensions. Reflexivity, ethics, and our epistemological stance is going to help us stay accountable to justice-centered research. Practice these efforts, right? Try to engage with them and engage critically with them. All right, thanks for your attention. We'll talk again soon.